I'm running a little bit, past my time, but I want to recognize some of the dignitaries that are with us this morning. Council Member David Cohen, City of San Jose Director of Deputy Director Rosalind Hugh, Director of the Department of Transportation Jones Risto, Director of the Office of Economic Development Nancy Klein, the Planning Department Assistant Director Robert Manford, and Zulma Maciel, the city's Office of Racial Equity, and she is our next speaker. So Zulma, I apologize that we're running a little late, but thank you for talking to us this morning. Zulma is actually the director of the city's newly created Office of Racial Equity. She has served the public for over 2 decades in various capacities, including her role in 2015 as the first director of San Jose's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Zulma is binational, Mexican and American, bilingual, and bicultural. So, bienvenida, Zulma. Thank you for joining us today and talk about this important priority for the city.
Good morning. And thank you for the invitation, and how wonderful to have heard from Alexa Arena just before this about how they engaged community. And, I was a part of that. And so I'm really happy to hear, the expression of meaningful community engagement and how that's a reliable research methodology. So a wonderful conversation.
And we'll talk about a little bit about that framework of equity, but let me ask you first about your office. Your office is brand new. Can you describe how your office was formed and what is the mission?
Yeah, so great question to start with. So the Office of Racial Equity came to be formed last June of 2020 when the mayor and the city council unanimously agreed and approved to establish the Office of Racial Equity. And that was after a couple of years of a lot of public dialogue, not only by the elected officials, but by community about the need to center equity in local government. So, there was some advocacy done by community partners as well as elected officials. And over the years, it just, a number of things happened. We had provided, the city administration had provided 2 council study sessions that really spoke to why the administration was embarking in this work around why is racial equity important and how do we actually implement a framework that helps us advance racial equity so that outcomes are improved for Black and Brown communities. And through those, I think that really helped put at least some level setting in the concepts and the terminology for the city organization. And that was in 2019. And then the pandemic hit in 2020. The killing of George Floyd last spring also then surged a number of conversations about race relations, about disproportionate outcomes for Black people. And so all of the converging of a lot of these things, and of course the increased incidents of hate crime against the Asian Pacific Islander community. So a lot happened in 2020 that really amplified and accentuated the need to have these conversations. So it was sort of this nexus of timing and opportunity, and the mayor and the city council unanimously approved creating this office in June 2020. And I was hired in October of last year. So just a few months into this role. I think your question was about the mission. So ultimately, right? Maybe I should just answer. So, we aim to advance a system change through a citywide racial equity framework that will examine and improve San Jose's internal policies, programs, and practices so that ultimately we improve outcomes for Black and Brown communities. So it's the Office of Racial Equity, the role of it is not to solve all problems, right? It's really to enable the organization to be able to do this at all levels and at all departments. It's everyone's work in local government. And so we're joining more than 150, maybe it's up to 200 other municipal governments across the US who've also determined that in order for us to achieve equity and more equitable outcomes by Black and Brown communities, then we need to acknowledge that local governments have had some fault in creating policies that either intentionally or unintentionally have burdened certain communities over others.
Thank you for talking about the mission and framing, the conversation with what are you trying to achieve? I am from Mexico. I'm a white Latina, so I was curious to understand, why racial equity as the title of the office, right? Not just equity, social equity. How about gender equity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I think everybody's still trying to understand. And I think that until we understand why we lead with race, and then I think that that's when we're actually going to see meaningful improvements and outcomes. And I'll tell you why. Racial equity is the condition that will be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicts life outcomes. So the reason we lead with race, we don't end with race though, we lead with race, is because we have to have targeted strategies to focus improvements for those that are worst off. So for example, when we think about disproportionate outcomes around economic and health and education, we could see that within women, there are disproportionate outcomes in those areas, right? But if you disaggregate the information in that data by race, almost always you're going to see that the disproportionate outcomes for women on health, education, and economic outcomes are worse off for Black women. When you think about opportunities in education and advancement, when you begin to disaggregate the data by race, you begin to see that by and large, Black and Brown communities are suffering. And so that's why we lead with race, because when we begin to look at what are those targeted strategies that will help lift and improve outcomes for those who are worse off, then we actually make improvements for everyone, whether it be women, women of color in general, able-bodied, LGBTQ community. There are a lot of intersections in this work. And so we acknowledge that those intersections exist. And so leading with race is a start, but it's not an end.
Thank you for that clarification. And in that racial equity framework, how is it going to be implemented? How are you going to work with the city? Is it that you actually going to work with specific departments through recommendations to city council? Tell us a little bit of how you're going to engage.
Yeah, so that's a really important piece to all of this, Katia. So thank you for asking the question, because there's this assumption that the Office of Racial Equity will do it all, but really the engagement is with department directors.
You're gonna do it all?
It doesn't appear that way. But I'm very encouraged by the city administration. We have incredible leadership across the board, directors, deputy city managers, and of course our city manager who helped open the space for the dialogues internally. There is commitment from leadership to learn how to do this. And so the role of the Office of Racial Equity is to teach how we apply the racial equity principles in all that we do. And so it's going to take some time, right? So part of that is training, and training will include how do we normalize conversations about race? What are the differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion? Just even terminology is very important. So for example, when we say, why do we need to know the differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion, is because, diversity is variety, it's quantity, it's different identities, it's cultures. Inclusion is participation of these different identities and cultures. And equity is about power and justice. And so we have to unpack what that means and the role of local government in ensuring that we are clear-eyed about advancing equity, and that all those other things, diversity and inclusion, are important to acknowledge, and they could be tools to actually do this work. So normalizing conversations about race, understanding the racial equity principles is going to be really important. And so we are in the process of negotiating a number of agreements with professional consultants who will help with roll out the training to senior and executive staff, and eventually to the rest of the organization. Because it's one thing to just understand why it's important, but it's very different on how do we actually apply this, right? The analysis that's required, the data sets that are required, the meaningful community engagement to use that as research methodology in the way that we approach this work. Ultimately creating then a system of accountability. So this is going to take time, and the role of the Office of Racial Equity is to make sure that we provide that kind of infrastructure for departments.
And you talk about that data, so do you have any data on the city staff and leadership and how diverse they are? And are there any specific departments that you have done a more in-depth benchmark analysis, where equity needs to be addressed first?
Yeah, so, I think something that we in the administration agree is that we all need to center equity in what we do, whether we're in the emergency operations center or transportation, environmental services. It's not about which department should go first. It's about just beginning the process now. And part of that is, some of the departments have already started this work. So they didn't wait for the Office of Racial Equity to be established to actually begin to move in this. So there have been members of the city organization who participated in the Government Alliance on Race and Equity training programs, which is a national organization that provides technical assistance to cities across the US. And those members of the city organization who've gone through this training have already begun to apply this work in their daily work. And so there are members of this group who are part of the housing department who's done tremendous work in applying racial equity principles in the way that they earmark their investments, in the way that they shape policy. The planning PBCE has also done the same thing, Office of Economic Development, Parks, Recreation, and Neighborhood Services, the library department, the IT department. I mean, many of the departments have already been moving this work forward. What we would like to do is actually help create the structure so it's sustainable, and then bring along the other departments to make sure that they understand what is this racial equity tool and how do we change our own internal mindset and operating system about the way that we view our work, so that we don't unintentionally reproduce policies that are harmful for Black and Brown communities specifically. So regarding your question about the data on the city staff and leadership and diversity, I was hoping to be able to pull that data last night, and I was unfortunately I was sidetracked and wasn't able to get that for you. But what I can say is that there is an acknowledgement that that we want to diversify the leadership. There's diversity across the organization, but really trying to ensure diversity in upper management is something that the city has as a goal. I just don't have those numbers for you at the moment.
No problem. I'm sure that this will be one of many conversations, and hopefully, we will see a change, and those numbers just become data, but the change is more important at the end. So, but let me go back. You were talking about, your work with the city officials, city staff. How about, is your office going to be a resource for nonprofit organizations, private companies? And then I have a follow-up question, on that one regarding small businesses.
Yeah, so, I feel like different sectors are in very different places for this. And so I think there's a lot to learn from our community partners and people with lived experience. So I feel like I'm learning more from them than I think that we would be a resource, for the community who lives and breathes this and feels this and experiences this every day. I think the nonprofit sector is well on their way to be able to integrate and center equity in the way that they design programs. I think nonprofit partners and community are going to be important allies in co-creating policies and programs that are benefit certain communities that have been harmed in the past. And so I feel like we're partners in this as we move forward. So I think what the city can offer, though, is we're good conveners and we create spaces for dialogue. And we're not going to be able to do this work without meaningful community engagement. So that's the relationship that I see there. In terms of the private sector, I think that there's also many opportunities to at least be able to have a shared language about equity, shared language about diversity and inclusion, and ultimately shared vision for what advancing racial equity looks like. Because advancing racial equity is a process, and achieving equity is ultimately what we're trying to do. And so I think it's going to take some time to be able to, kind of untangle these concepts and these terms, and then come to a place where we can, when we speak about it, we really know what we're talking about, right? We don't have to ask, so how would you define equity? Well, how do you define, these different concepts? So once we're able to have shared language, I think multiple sectors are going to be able to really begin to dive deeply into conversations about why are there disproportionate outcomes? Do we agree that we need to do a root cause analysis? Do we agree that we need to look at the history, right? To be grounded in history, in facts, and to be able to, then move forward so that we can make significant system changes.
And you're right. Every industry, every company would have different values, but also different missions. So while the definition of equity may be broad and understood, everybody's going to adapt it in a way, that aligns with our vision and mission. So for the San Jose Downtown Association, equity for us is a downtown that is open for all. And in this, there's a big emphasis and the main focus on small businesses and lifting them up. Some of them are actually disadvantaged, particularly, in the past year, in the current economic system. So what direction would you give an organization like ours to promote socioeconomic equity and equity in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to tell you that in my work with and serving in service of immigrant and refugees, through the original Welcoming San Jose plan, we had a goal around supporting entrepreneurship and small businesses, because we know that in San Jose, there's a large percentage, probably over 50%, of small businesses that are owned by foreign-born people. And so when we engaged the community, we asked about what are the kinds of things we ought to be working on. They said this back in 2015, and they said it again last year. We would like the city's support in advancing educational and economic opportunities among immigrants and refugees through job skills, training, strengthening career pathways, promotion of entrepreneurship, small business retention and growth, and financial literacy. And so over the last few years, we've done some partnerships with organizations that work specifically with micro enterprises or small home-based businesses and business districts like the Alum Rock district. So during this past year over COVID, we recognize that there is a greater need. And again, the Office of Racial Equity doesn't take on the role of the Office of Economic Development. So we worked, in close coordination with the wonderful team at the Office of Economic Development and the Latino Business Foundation to assess the needs of the business community in East San Jose. And what we were able to offer is not so much the solutions, but we demonstrated what a viable survey looks like and community engagement to help inform the data that we already had. And so what I mean by that is that we put into practice and we demonstrated what it looks like to do focus groups, or what it looks like to do a meaningful community survey, or a community engagement process where it's not just about informing about what we believe we should be doing, but collaborating, where the solutions emerge from the small business owners in order to design a program that actually would benefit them. And so the data from the survey helped develop this co-design of and it's still in development with the Latino Business Foundation. But what I think that what we were able to offer in terms of our consultation and technical assistance is something that the Latino Business Foundation, as well as members of the Office of Economic Development, can repurpose, right? Can use the way our tools and our approach in the way that they do, future engagement with community to solve local problems.
We talked at the beginning about your mission, but how about the future? What are your goals for next year?
Yes, thank you for that question. There's a lot to do, and part of the framework that we're using in terms of the Office of Racial Equity is one that's shared by other cities that are doing this work, and that's first normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing. And what I mean by that is under this normalizing frame, it's really normalizing conversations about race, and it's providing training and capacity building for the organization to be able to carry out this work in all that we do, and that it becomes organic, right? That it's embedded, that it's baked in, and that it's not an afterthought. Under organizing, it means to not only stand up this Office of Racial Equity. The good news is I get to hire 2 people, so it just won't be me and my assistant. And there are the 2 members of the Immigrant Affairs team will join my team, and so we'll be incorporating that work. But I get to establish this office by hiring 2 more people, and that's part of the organizing. But there's also all this other work that's happening in multiple departments. They've got racial equity teams. They have, some of them have already have racial equity action plans. And so for us, it's about being able to support that work and not get in the way of it. And then operationally, while we'd like to have the space to do normalizing and organizing first, there are a lot of urgent matters that we need to address immediately. And so some of the priorities for the Office of Racial Equity are embedding equity in the budget process. The second one is supporting the reimagining community safety work. The third one is participating and also embedding equity in community and economic recovery as a result of COVID. And then the fourth piece of our plan is to integrate seamlessly, hopefully, the work of the Immigrant Affairs team and the Welcoming San Jose plan into the Office of Racial Equity. So those are big chunks of work that we are going to take on over this next year that I'm already seeing will probably,
go
well beyond this first year.
And you heard the presentation from Alexa, and at the beginning of the presentation, you said that you were part of that process. So is it in the next year also one of your goals to continue working with Google to keep reinforcing the ideas of that overall equity framework and what they do?
Yeah, and so what I meant by being part of that process, I was interviewed by the consultant that was working on this, and I feel like a lot of sort of my thinking around particularly the fund and how that should work was reflected. And it's probably because I wasn't the only one that was saying similar things about community engagement and really giving the power over to community to decide how to best invest those funds. I think many of us felt heard, and that's why I'm so pleased about that, the way that has turned out. In terms of the, specific to the Google project, I don't know what my involvement will be, but I think related to the community engagement portion of it and ensuring that, again, it's meaningful community engagement that's collaborative. And people in the city, many of the people in the city already understand the spectrum of community engagement from informing to power, and involving and collaboration is really the space that we want to be in. And refining the way that we do that as an organization is something that we're working on and we're truly invested in.
So very similar to the last question that I asked Alexa of when, but to you, I'll change it a little bit. How are we going to see change, in the city? And who will be accountable? Is it you, your office, the staff that you're going to hire? Is it actually the entire city, and at the end, each one of us, to make a difference.
Yeah, so I think the first thing we need to do is, what is the change that we collectively want to see? Because the city organization is just one sector and is just, one piece of the puzzle here. So first, an agreement on what are those indicators that are going to tell us whether or not things are better off for certain people. And if we can all agree on, for example, that set of indicators, and I would say that for the San Jose Downtown Association and maybe people who are viewing this now, 2 to 3 indicators around economic well-being, jobs, or whatever it is, if we can agree on those indicators and then begin to work backwards on, okay, what are the things that influence those indicators, whether it be the private sector, local government, education, there are a number of things. And so when we agree on the population indicators we want to change and map out, so what are the strategies that are going to impact that change? And that's basically the theory of change, right? That if we can get on the same page and be able to then move towards, like I said earlier, the same framing about the way that we see these issues, the desired impact that we want to see, producing and having the data at our disposal, which is disaggregated by race, meaningful community engagement, and then identify how are we going to hold each other accountable, right? For making sure that we're going to get to that indicator that we all agreed was really important to all of us. I think there's still a lot of work, ahead, but I'm hopeful just with these conversations, and the fact that I was invited here today is meaningful, right? The fact that we're now in dialogue is really an important start.
And I'm sure there are many members of the community that have a lot of ideas. I know Ramiro Torres, he's also a Mexican architect. So we would love to continue the conversation, at the San Jose Downtown Association level, but with different organizations, throughout the city in order to continue the dialogue, as you mentioned. So do you mind sharing your email address in a way that, that people can contact you?
Sure, I can do that. Should I put that in the chat?
If you can do that, that would be great.
Yes, I will do that. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Zulma, for joining us this morning, for having this conversation with us. And again, I hope it's not the last time, that we have this conversation and talk about small businesses and that promotion of socioeconomic equity that is very important, to our BIPOC and small business community.
That's right. Thank you so much, Katia, for a wonderful dialogue.
Well, and we had close to 215 people on Facebook at a certain point. So thank you again to the people that joined us on Facebook Live. Thank you for those that participated in the chat this morning. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we promised to share those with both our presenters. And a reminder that before you leave, the farmers market will be open May 7th and our new location in the SoFa district, South First Street between San Salvador and William Street. So look forward to seeing you there. Thank you everybody this morning and have a good weekend.